The box wasn't heavy. That's what I remember most. How light it was in my hands, a small gift box wrapped in a bow handed to me across my own dining room table on the evening of my 58th birthday. My daughter-in-law smiled when I opened it. Inside, a pair of yellow dish gloves. Heavy duty. The kind you use when the job is too dirty for bare hands. I thought these would be more useful for you than anything else, she said. The table laughed. My son looked away. My husband refilled his glass. I said thank you, set the box down, and kept smiling for the rest of the evening through the cake I had baked in the kitchen I had owned for 31 years in the house that still had my name on every single document in the deed. That's the part she didn't know. That's the part nobody knew because I had spent so long being the woman who cooked the meals and kept the peace and asked for nothing that they had all forgotten something important. They forgot to ask whose house they were sitting in. What happens next is not a story about anger. I want you to understand that from the beginning. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not call a single person that night. I opened a drawer I hadn't opened in years, read what was inside, and made one phone call the following morning. And everything they thought was theirs fell apart inside of 48 hours. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you is the story of how I went from the woman holding the dish gloves to the woman who held all the cards, and I want you to see every single moment of it. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 58 years old, and for more than 2 decades I worked as a regional accounts manager for a mid-size insurance firm before stepping away at 55 to care for my mother through the last years of her illness. By the time she passed, I had been so long in the business of managing other people's needs, their schedules, their paperwork, their comfort, that I had simply continued doing it at home, and no one in my family had ever thought to ask whether I minded. That is the woman who stood in the kitchen at 5:30 on a Tuesday evening in October, pressing the back of her hand to a pan of roasted carrots to test the temperature while the smell of a slow-cooked chicken moved through a house that had been full of people for most of the afternoon, and would be fuller still by the time the sun went down. It was my birthday. I had cooked every dish on the table myself. I want to tell you about that kitchen before I tell you anything else, because you need to understand what kind of place it was. It was not a large kitchen. My father had built this house in 1974, a practical man who believed in rooms that did their job without pretension, and the kitchen reflected that. The countertops were pale cream, worn smooth at the edges from years of use. There was a small window above the sink that looked out over the back garden, and in the late afternoon light of autumn, everything it touched turned a color I can only describe as the particular gold that belongs to the end of things. I had stood at that window washing dishes for 31 years. My children had grown up in this kitchen. My mother had sat at that table the Thanksgiving before she passed and told me it was the best meal she had ever eaten in her life. This was not just a kitchen. It was the physical record of everything I had built. Vanessa arrived 40 minutes after the time she had told me she would be there. She did not apologize for this. She came through the front door with Daniel behind her, her coat still on her phone in her hand, and she swept into the kitchen and looked at the counter where I had laid out the food and said without quite looking at me that everything smelled wonderful. I thanked her and asked if she would like something to drink. She said she had brought wine, and she handed Daniel the bottle without looking at him, either the way people hand things to furniture they have arranged just so. My daughter Laura was already at the table. She had driven in from Maplewood that afternoon and helped me set the table before the others arrived, folding the napkins the way my mother used to fold them, small and careful, and placed exactly 1 inch from the edge of the plate. Laura does things with that kind of attention. She always has. She was 33 years old and still the person in the room I trusted most to notice things quietly and say nothing until the right moment. Richard came to the table last, which was also the way he did most things, arriving when the work was already done, settling into his place at the end of the table with the ease of a man who has never once set a fork. We ate. The conversation moved around the table the way it always did at these dinners, lightly, carefully, nobody saying anything too direct. Vanessa talked about a renovation she had seen in a magazine. Daniel agreed with everything she said. Richard asked about the game that was on later. I refilled the water glasses and passed things when they were needed and listened to the familiar rhythm of a family meal that had somehow over the years become a performance I watched from a particular distance. Then came the gift. Vanessa set the box in front of me with a smile that was polished and warm and completely without warmth underneath. I unwrapped it slowly the way I do with everything, taking my time. And when I lifted the lid and saw what was inside, those yellow gloves, stiff and bright, folded flat inside a box too nice for what they contained, I looked up at her. She said what she said. The table responded the way it did. I set the box down beside my plate and smiled and said thank you and meant none of it. At the end of the table, Laura did not laugh. She looked at me for just a moment, one careful measuring look, and I understood from it that she had been watching Vanessa far longer than I had. That whatever she had seen, she had been holding in reserve. For the first time that evening, I wondered what my daughter knew. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the dark for a long time after Richard had gone, still beside me, listening to the house settle the way old houses do, in the cold, small sounds, familiar ones, the kind that stop registering as sound after enough years and simply become the texture of a place. I had lived inside that texture for 31 years. I knew every creak and shift of it the way I knew my own handwriting. And lying there in the quiet, I found myself thinking not about the gloves, not about the box or the smile or the way the table had laughed, but about something much larger and slower that I had been refusing to name for a very long time. Because the gloves had not come from nowhere. That was the thing I lay there with until well past midnight. They had come from somewhere very specific, from a direction and a distance that I could trace clearly if I was willing to turn around and look at how far back it went. And that night, for reasons I could not entirely explain, I was finally willing. It had begun small, the way these things always do. Vanessa had moved into the house with Daniel 4 years earlier, a temporary arrangement they called it, while they saved for a place of their own. And in the first weeks, she had been considerate enough, careful in the particular way of someone who is watching and assessing before they begin to rearrange. By the third month, she had reorganized the kitchen cabinets. She did not ask. She simply arrived home one afternoon while I was at the pharmacy, and when I came back, the cabinet where I had kept the baking dishes for 11 years held something else entirely, and the baking dishes were somewhere new. Daniel, when I mentioned it, gently said it was more efficient this way. He said Vanessa knew about these things. He said it as though my 30 years of managing that kitchen had been a long apprenticeship that had finally reached its natural conclusion. I let it go. I had let so many things go by then that letting one more thing go required no effort at all. What followed was not a series of dramatic incidents. I want to be precise about that because I think people expect cruelty to announce itself loudly, to arrive with raised voices and slammed doors. What Vanessa did was quieter than that, and for that reason far more effective. It was the accumulation of small replacements. She began answering questions that were directed at me, not interrupting exactly, but stepping in at the half-second before I could respond, smoothly enough that most people in the room did not notice. She began making plans that involved my house and my schedule without consulting me first, then informing me of those plans in a tone that assumed agreement. She spoke about the future of the family, holidays, arrangements, long-term decisions, as though the house were already her domain, and I were a long-time resident whose comfort was considered but whose opinion was optional. And she never once called me Mom. I had registered this from the beginning and told myself it did not matter that some people simply were not comfortable with the word, that it was a small thing. But small things are the architecture of how people position each other. She called me Evelyn, always Evelyn, in a tone that placed us at a precise social distance that said, you are the woman who lives here, and I am the woman who is deciding what happens here, and we both know the difference. The moment that stayed with me most clearly happened on an evening in late August, about 6 months before that birthday dinner. I had come home earlier than expected from a visit to Margaret's, and found Vanessa in the sitting room on the phone, her voice low and easy, speaking to someone I could not identify. She had not heard me come in. I stood in the hallway for a moment, not intending to eavesdrop, and caught perhaps 10 seconds of her side of the conversation before I moved away. What I caught was this: her voice relaxed and warm in the way it never quite was when she knew I could hear her, and the words casual, dismissive, unbothered that she used to describe me to whoever was on the other end of that line. She doesn't really do much. We basically manage everything around here. I stood in the hallway for a moment after she said it. I did not go in. I went instead to the kitchen and started the kettle and stood at that window above the sink with my hands flat on the counter and the garden going dark outside, and I thought about what it means to be erased in increments, not attacked, not confronted, simply edited slowly out of the story of your own life until the story belongs to someone else, and you are a detail in the background that the main character works around. 2 days later, I called Margaret. I did not explain all of it, not then. I said only that I had been thinking. Margaret, who has known me for 58 years and requires very little scaffolding to understand what I mean, was quiet for a moment, and then said, "What took you so long?" I did not have a good answer for that. But I was beginning to understand that the question mattered less than what I decided to do with the time I still had. The night after I called Margaret, I could not settle. I went to bed at the usual hour and lay in the particular restless way that is not quite wakefulness and not quite sleep, where the mind moves too quickly for the body to follow, circling the same territory without arriving anywhere. Richard slept without difficulty, as he always did. I listened to his breathing even out and become steady, and after a while I gave up on the idea of sleeping at all and got up quietly, put on the robe that hung behind the bathroom door, and went downstairs. I did not turn on the main lights. I knew the house too well to need them, and there was something about the dark that felt appropriate to where I was in my own thinking, not lost but not ready yet for the full illumination of things. I went to the kitchen first out of habit, put the kettle on, and stood at the window while the water heated. The garden was black and still. The neighbor's porch light threw a thin edge of yellow along the fence line, and I stood there long enough to watch a cat move through it and disappear into the dark on the other side. Then I went down the hall to my father's study. It had been his room when he was alive, and after he passed almost 11 years ago now, I had kept it more or less as it was his desk, his bookshelves, the particular smell of old paper and wood polish that no amount of time had dispersed. I used it occasionally for correspondence or the quiet kind of reading that requires a door, but there was a drawer in the lower left side of the desk that I had not opened in years. I knew what was in it. I simply had not had occasion or reason, or whatever the right word is for the particular combination of will and readiness that brings a person back to something they have been gently setting aside. I sat down in my father's chair, opened the drawer, and took out the leather portfolio he had prepared before he died. He had been a careful man, a deliberate man, the kind of man who organized his affairs with the same attention he gave to everything else, which is to say completely without gaps. Inside the portfolio, arranged in labeled sleeves, was the full documentation of what he had left me. The deed to the house with my name typed clean and clear across the top. The account statements for the investment portfolio he had been quietly building since I was in my 20s, intended, as he had told me once without sentimentality, to make certain I was never dependent on anyone else's goodwill. A deed for a piece of land in Connecticut that he had purchased when property was cheap and held because he believed in holding things. All of it in my name. Only my name. Evelyn Ruth Carter, as I had been before. I was anyone's wife, anyone's mother, anyone's cook or housekeeper or background presence in a room full of other people's plans. I sat with those documents for a long time. What came to me slowly in the quiet of that study was not surprise exactly. I had known these things existed in the way you know something that you have stored so carefully you have almost stopped knowing it at all. What came to me was something closer to recognition, and beneath it something that felt uncomfortably like shame. Not at my father's generosity, at my own long drift away from it. After he passed, I had handed the practical management of our finances to Richard. Not because he asked for it, not because of any single conversation or decision, but because it was simply what happened over time when I was tired and he was willing, and I had told myself it did not matter who held the papers as long as everything was all right. I had trusted him with the numbers and then gradually, year by year, had stopped asking about them. I had stopped thinking of myself as the owner of anything and started thinking of myself as the person who lived in a house, which is a different thing entirely. What my father had given me with such precision and care I had not lost, but I had set down so long ago that I had forgotten the weight of it in my hands. I sat on the floor of that study I had moved from the chair at some point without quite deciding to, and held the deed in my lap and looked at my own name and thought about what 30 years of making myself agreeable had actually cost. The phone on the side table lit up at 11 minutes past 11. Laura. I looked at the screen for a moment before I answered, something loosening in my chest at the sight of her name in the dark room. She said she had been thinking about me all day. She asked if I was all right. Her voice was careful in the way it sometimes was, not worried exactly, but paying attention at a level slightly above the ordinary. I told her I was fine. It was not entirely true, but something in the quality of her asking, the directness of it, the sense that she already knew the answer was more complicated than I would give her, told me that I was not in fact alone in this. Whatever this was, whatever I was just beginning to understand it was, my name was on everything. Every account, every deed, every document recording what was real and what was owned and what could not be taken without consequence. All of it mine. And not one of the people sleeping in my house had ever stopped in 5 years to ask what that actually meant. I put the leather portfolio back in the drawer before I went to bed that night, but I did not lock it. That small difference mattered to me in a way I would not have been able to explain clearly to anyone else. For years, that drawer had been a place I went to forget something. From that night forward, it was a place I intended to return to. In the days that followed, I began to pay attention differently. Not with suspicion, that is not quite the right word, but with the deliberate focus of someone who has realized that they have been looking at a room without actually seeing what is in it. I had been moving through my own house for years with the comfortable inattention of familiarity, and what I understood now was that familiarity had made me careless. There were things happening in plain sight that I had registered, and then set aside, filed under the vague category of things I did not have the energy to examine. I began to examine them. I noticed first the questions. Vanessa had a habit, which I now recognized as a pattern rather than casual conversation, of asking about the future in ways that were framed as concern. Over the past year, she had asked me at various moments and with varying degrees of directness what my long-term intentions were for the house, whether Richard and I had thought about downsizing, whether I had considered what the property would look like as part of an estate. Each time, I had answered briefly and moved the conversation elsewhere, taking the questions at face value, filing them under thoughtful planning, the kind of thing a practical person raised. What I understood now was that they were not casual. They were research. I noticed second the envelope. It appeared on the kitchen counter on a Wednesday morning in late October, a business-sized envelope, cream-colored, with a return address from a law office in a county 40 miles east of us. I had not seen it arrive. I reached for it, intending only to set it more neatly to one side, and Vanessa was across the kitchen before I had fully extended my hand. She picked it up in one smooth motion, said it was something related to Daniel's business sent to the wrong address, and took it with her when she left the room. The whole exchange lasted perhaps 4 seconds. I stood at the counter for a moment afterward, aware of something I could not name precisely, and then I made coffee and went about my morning. I noticed third the documents. Daniel had a habit of bringing paperwork to the kitchen table, forms, agreements, things that required his signature, and working through them quickly, the way he had always done everything quickly, without great interest in the particulars. He signed what was put in front of him. He had done this for as long as I could remember. What was different now was the person standing behind his chair while he did it. Vanessa did not sit beside him during these sessions. She stood. She pointed to the relevant lines. She answered his questions before he had fully formed them. And when the forms were signed, she gathered them and took them with her, and Daniel returned to whatever he had been doing before, and the whole transaction had the texture of something managed rather than shared. I called Margaret on a Thursday evening and told her what I had been observing. Margaret listened the way she always listened, which was completely and without interruption, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant she was deciding how much to tell me. What she told me took longer to absorb than anything I had been expecting. Margaret had a friend, a woman she had known since her working years, whose daughter had gone through a difficult divorce several years earlier, and through that connection, Margaret had spent the past week making careful inquiries about something that had been troubling her since before my birthday. What she had learned relayed through the considered language of someone who understood she was carrying information with weight to it was this: Vanessa had consulted at least once, and possibly more than once, with a matrimonial attorney in the next county. The nature of those consultations appeared to center on a specific legal question: whether assets that had been inherited by a spouse, separate property, acquired before the marriage, or received as a gift or inheritance during it, could be reclassified as marital property if they had been over many years effectively absorbed into the shared life of the household. I sat with that for a long moment before I said anything. It was not fraud. I needed to understand that clearly, and I did. It was not forgery, not theft, not anything that broke a law in the ordinary sense. It was a legal argument, one that existed in the actual language of actual statutes, one that attorneys made and courts considered, one that turned on a concept called commingling, which is the legal description of what happens when separate property and shared finances become difficult to distinguish from each other over a long enough period of time. The argument, if it succeeded, would force a division of assets in a formal legal proceeding. It would reach the house. It would reach everything my father had put my name on with such care. She was not moving impulsively. She was not moving carelessly. She had found a legitimate path through existing law toward everything I owned, and she had been walking it quietly, gathering information, building a position while I cooked dinner and cleared the table and thanked her for a box of gloves. Margaret said it plainly because Margaret always said things plainly. Evelyn, she is not after the silverware. She is after the whole house. I told Margaret I needed to make a phone call in the morning. Margaret said she knew exactly who I needed to call. She was right. Thomas Whitaker had handled my father's estate for the better part of 2 decades, which meant he had known me in the particular way that lawyers know the families they serve since before my father's health began to decline. He was a careful, unhurried man who kept a small private office in a town about 40 miles from ours, separate from the larger firm where he spent most of his working week, and it was to that private office that I drove the following Friday morning, without telling anyone in the house where I was going. That detail mattered to me. I had not made a deliberate effort to conceal an appointment from my own family since before my children were grown, and there was something clarifying about doing it now. Not secretive, not anxious, but clean in the way that a decision made, entirely by oneself, feels clean. I told Richard I was running errands. He nodded without looking up from his coffee. I got in the car and I drove. Thomas's private office was on the 2nd floor of a narrow building on a quiet commercial street, up a flight of stairs that creaked reliably on the 3rd step. His assistant brought coffee in proper ceramic mugs, not paper cups, and set them on the low table between the chairs without ceremony. Thomas came in 2 minutes after I arrived, sat down across from me, folded his hands, and waited for me to begin. He was that kind of man. He gave you the room first. I told him everything. I started with the portfolio in the drawer, the documentation my father had organized, the assets that had sat in my name untouched and unexamined for years while I drifted away from them. I told him about Vanessa's questions and the envelope from the county law firm and what Margaret had learned through her careful indirect inquiries. I laid it out in the order it had happened, which was also roughly the order in which I had understood it, and Thomas listened without expression, which I recognized as his version of full attention. When I finished, he asked me several questions, precise practical questions about dates and account structures and whether anything had been signed jointly over the years in ways I might not have fully tracked. I answered what I could and said plainly when I did not know. He wrote things down in the small notebook he always kept open on the arm of his chair. Then he set the pen down and looked at me steadily for a moment before he spoke. The news, he said, was substantially better than I might have feared. My father had been thorough in a way that he told me he did not often encounter. Every asset had been titled in my name alone from the beginning and without exception. There were no joint accounts into which those assets had been formally transferred, no co-signed documents, no recorded transactions that would suggest deliberate absorption into the shared marital estate. The legal argument that Vanessa had been quietly researching the commingling claim required, in order to succeed, a demonstrable pattern of intent evidence that the separate property had been treated over time as belonging to the household, in a formal rather than merely practical sense. My father's documentation made that argument very difficult to construct. The paper trail was clean, the titles were clear, the positions were mine. But Thomas was careful not to let that become a reason for complacency. The argument, he said, was difficult. It was not impossible. Matrimonial law had room in it for persistence, and a sufficiently motivated attorney with a willing client and adequate time could make a case with less foundation than this one had. The protection I had was strong, but it was only useful if I was willing to maintain it actively rather than relying on its historical tidiness to do the work for me. He outlined 3 steps. The first was to formally document and reinforce the separation of my inherited assets from any household finances in a way that created a current record alongside the historical one. The second was to place a protective notice on the deed, a straightforward filing that would flag any attempt to alter the title and require my direct authorization before anything could proceed. The third was to establish what he called a readiness position, to have the relevant documents organized and accessible, the legal responses prepared, so that if anything was filed against my interests, we could move quickly rather than scrambling. None of it required confrontation. None of it required me to say a single word inside my own house. It was all paperwork, all quiet, all conducted at a careful distance from the daily life that continued around me. That was important to me. I was not ready for confrontation. I was not sure confrontation was the right instrument at all. What I wanted first was to know exactly where I stood. Thomas walked me through each step with the unhurried thoroughness I had always trusted in him. Before I left, he said one thing that I carried with me for a long time afterward. He said that my position was very strong. Then he paused in the particular way of a man who understands that what he says next is the part that actually matters. A strong position, he said, is only useful if you are willing to defend it. I thanked him. I walked back down the stairs, the third step creaking exactly as it always had. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, watching the ordinary traffic of a Friday morning move along the street outside. Then I drove home, went in through the back door, and started thinking about what came next. The weeks that followed my meeting with Thomas had a particular quality to them that I found, to my own mild surprise, easier to sustain than I had expected. I went about the ordinary business of the house, the meals, the errands, the maintenance of the daily rhythms that had structured my life for so long with the same surface consistency I had always maintained, while underneath that surface, something had quietly reorganized itself. I was the same person in every visible respect. I simply knew things I had not known before, and that knowledge changed the texture of everything I observed without changing anything about the way I appeared to observe it. Vanessa was at her most confident during this period. I noticed it with a clarity I would not have had 2 months earlier, before I had begun to understand what her confidence was actually built on. She moved through the house with a kind of settled authority that had been growing gradually since she and Daniel arrived, and had recently reached what I recognized in retrospect as its fullest expression. She was not aggressive about it. She had never needed to be aggressive. What she had was something more durable than aggression, a steady, unquestioned assumption of centrality, the manner of someone who has already decided that the outcome is settled and is now simply waiting for the details to arrange themselves accordingly. On a Saturday morning in late November, approximately 3 weeks after my visit to Thomas's office, Vanessa invited 2 women to the house for lunch. I learned of this when I came downstairs at 9 o'clock and found her in the kitchen making a list on her phone. She told me the friends were coming at noon. She did not ask whether this was convenient. She told me in the same tone she used to report weather or describe a traffic delay that she would need the front sitting room clear, and that she had already planned a salad. The way she said it, I would not need to worry, was the particular construction she used when she meant the opposite when she was arranging things, so that I would be at the margins of my own house while she occupied its center. I told her that sounded fine. I went upstairs and called Margaret for 11 minutes, and then came back down and put the kettle on. The 2 women arrived just after noon. I did not know them. They were Vanessa's age, dressed with the specific casualness of people who have put considerable thought into appearing not to have done so, and they greeted me briefly at the door before Vanessa steered them toward the sitting room, with the ease of a woman who had been directing traffic in that hallway for years. I brought out a plate of things I had prepared while she made her salad, set it on the table without comment, and left them to it. From the kitchen I could hear the conversation in the way you can hear things in an old house, not every word but the shape and movement of it. The voices rose and fell. There was laughter. And then Vanessa's voice, clear enough to reach me without effort, describing the house in a way that lodged in my chest and stayed there. She was talking about changes. The kitchen, she said, needed a full renovation, the layout was impractical, and the countertops were dated. The study at the end of the hall, she said, would make a perfect home office for Daniel once it was properly cleared out. The back garden had potential that wasn't being used. She spoke about the bones of the place with the appreciative authority of someone evaluating a property they intended to develop, and her friends responded with the enthusiasm of people who are being invited to share in a vision rather than being asked for their opinion of it. I stood at the kitchen counter and listened and did not move. Then she said it. Her voice was easy, almost offhand, in the way that reveals what a person considers to be an established fact that requires no particular emphasis. When this place is finally ours, she said, I want to take down that old fence and extend the deck all the way to the garden wall. One of the friends said it would be beautiful. The other asked about the permits. I set down the dish I was holding very carefully and looked out the window at the fence in question, the fence my father had built in 1981 with lumber he had selected himself and painted white every 3 years for the rest of his life. Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point during this, as he sometimes did on weekend afternoons, looking for coffee or something to occupy the 20 minutes before whatever came next on his schedule. He glanced at me. I was still looking at the window, He looked at me for a moment longer than was casual, long enough for something to pass between us, or nearly pass, and then he went to the coffee maker and poured a cup and left without saying anything. He had heard what she said. I was certain of it. He had heard it, and he had poured his coffee, and he had gone. That evening I sent Thomas a short message. I told him I thought we needed to move our timeline up. He responded within the hour. He said he would prepare the next steps and asked me to come in at my earliest convenience. I looked at the message for a moment. In the quiet of my bedroom, the house settled around me, and I thought, she is so certain. She has been certain for so long. I typed a reply to Thomas confirming a day, and then I put the phone down and turned off the light. Laura called on a Sunday morning 3 days after I had sent Thomas the message about moving the timeline. She called at the particular hour just after 8, when she knew I would be up, but before the house had fully collected itself for the day, and asked if I would meet her for coffee. Not at the house. She named a place in Millfield, a small town about 20 minutes east of us, a cafe she had been to once or twice with a friend who lived in that direction. I said yes without asking why. Something in the way she had phrased it, not a casual invitation, but a considered one, the kind that has been held for a moment before it is offered, told me that the reason would keep until I got there. I told Richard I was meeting Laura. He said that was nice. I drove the 20 minutes through a gray December morning with the radio off, watching the flat winter fields move past the windows, and I thought about my daughter in the particular way you think about someone when you are about to learn something about them that will change the shape of what you thought you already knew. She was there before me. She had chosen a corner table facing the room, and she had not ordered yet. She stood when she saw me come through the door, not from formality, but from the slight restlessness of someone who has been containing something for a while, and is relieved that the wait is nearly over. We hugged. We sat. The woman behind the counter brought us coffee without being asked, and Laura wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at me directly. She did not lead into it. That was always Laura's way. She had gotten it from her grandfather, that directness, that refusal to spend more words on the approach than the thing itself required. "Mom," she said, "I know about the accounts. I know about the house. I know what Grandpa left you. I have known for 4 years." I set my coffee down. The cafe was quiet around us, a couple at the counter, a man reading alone near the window, the low sound of something instrumental coming from a speaker I could not locate. I looked at my daughter's face. She was watching me with the steadiness of someone who has been holding a weight carefully for a long time and has decided finally to set it down in the right place. I asked her how. She told me that my father had come to her privately in the last 2 months before he died. He had been organized about his dying in the way he had been organized about everything, making certain that the things which needed to be said were said directly and to the right person. He had sat with Laura for almost 2 hours. One afternoon, she told me, and had gone through what he was leaving and why. And he had said something to her that she had carried since then without knowing quite what to do with it. He had said, "Your mother is the one who built everything. Make sure she knows that someday." Laura had been 29 years old when he said it. She had listened and understood and kept it. She had watched me over the 4 years since, and she had watched Vanessa, and she had stayed quiet. I asked her the only question I had. "Why didn't you say anything?" She looked at me steadily and said what she said, and I have thought about it almost every day since. She said, "Because if I had told you, it would have been me saving you. I didn't want to be the one who saved you. I wanted you to save yourself. It had to come from you, Mom. It had to be your choice, not mine. If I had handed you the information, it would have been my story. I needed it to be yours." I sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, a car moved slowly through the empty Sunday street. The man near the window turned a page. I thought about my father, who had known exactly what he was doing when he spoke to my daughter, instead of simply telling me himself. He had known that I would need to find my own way to it. He had trusted Laura to understand the difference between guarding a truth and withholding it. They had both understood something about me that I was only now catching up to. Then Laura said the other thing. She set her mug down, and her voice shifted slightly, not in volume but in register, the way a person speaks when they move from something they have been carrying gently to something that requires more care. She said that Vanessa had been calling her. Over the past several months, she said the calls had become more frequent and more pointed. Vanessa was asking about the family finances in ways that were framed as casual, but were not casual at all. Asking what Laura knew about the estate, about what Grandpa had left, about how things were structured. Laura had been careful, she told me, vague, without being evasive, giving nothing that could be used. But the calls had been coming with a regularity that told her something was moving faster now than it had been. Vanessa was probing with more urgency than she had shown before, as though she had a reason to believe the window was narrowing. "I don't think you have as much time as you thought," Laura said. "I think she is close to something." I looked at my daughter across the small table in the quiet corner of a cafe that neither of us usually came to, and I thought about my father sitting with her all those years ago, trusting her with the weight of knowing, waiting for me to find my own way to it. I had found it. I told Laura I had already called Thomas. Her shoulders dropped slightly, the way a person's shoulders drop when they have been braced for longer than they realized, and she reached across the table and put her hand over mine for a moment without saying anything at all. I drove home from Millfield with a different kind of quiet in the car than the one I had driven out with. It was not relief exactly, and it was not urgency, though both of those things were present somewhere underneath the surface. It was closer to the feeling of a room coming into focus, the sensation of having been half seeing something for a long time and then quite suddenly seeing it whole. Laura had given me nothing I did not already know in some form. What she had given me was the knowledge that someone else had been carrying it alongside me carefully and at great cost to herself, and that I was not working from a position of isolation as I had believed for longer than I wanted to admit. The house was quiet when I got back. Richard's car was in the drive, but I did not find him immediately, which meant he was in the back room watching something on the television he kept there for weekend afternoons. Daniel's car was absent. Vanessa's was in the garage. I came in through the back door, set my keys on the counter, and stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the particular stillness of a house that contains people who are not moving. I went down the hall to my father's study with the intention of pulling out the portfolio again. There was a specific account statement I wanted to review before my next conversation with Thomas, and I pushed open the door and found Vanessa standing at the desk. She had the lower left drawer open. Not all the way, but enough. Her hand was resting on the lip of the drawer, and she was looking at the leather portfolio with the expression of someone who has found something and is deciding how to respond to having found it. She looked up when I came in. She did not startle the way a person startles when they are caught doing something they know to be wrong. She looked up the way she always looked up, with the composed, level expression. That was her version of a neutral face, which had always carried within it the particular quality of someone who believes the advantage belongs to them regardless of the circumstances. She asked me what was in the portfolio. I came into the room and crossed to the desk at a normal pace and looked at what she was holding, which was not the portfolio itself, but a letter that had been sitting in the drawer beside it. A piece of correspondence from Thomas's place office from the previous year, a brief letter confirming a consultation appointment and referencing in the dry language of legal offices, asset documentation, and protective filings. It was not on its own specific enough to explain everything, but it was specific enough to prompt a question from someone who was already looking for reasons to ask one. I looked at the letter and then at Vanessa and said in a tone that I kept entirely even that it was correspondence from when Richard and I had updated our estate arrangements the previous year. I said that Thomas had handled our family's legal affairs for decades, that the letter was old business and nothing of current relevance. Then I looked at her steadily for a moment and asked quietly whether there was a particular reason she had been going through my desk. She absorbed this. She set the letter down on the surface of the desk rather than back in the drawer, which was a small assertion I noted and did not react to. She said she had been looking for a pen and had opened the wrong drawer. She said it with complete composure. She was very good. I had always known she was very good. I picked up the letter and put it back in the drawer and closed it. She was moving toward the door when she stopped. It was a casual stop, the kind a person makes when a thought occurs to them on the way to somewhere else, though I understood by then that very few things Vanessa did were casual in origin. She turned back and asked me in an easy tone what Thomas's full name was. She said she did not think she had heard me mention him before. I told her, Thomas Whitaker. She nodded pleasantly and left. I stood in my father's study and listened to her footsteps move down the hall, and I thought about what she would do with that name. She would search it. She would find that Thomas Whitaker maintained a practice with a specific focus, not general family law, not wills in the ordinary sense, but estate planning and asset protection, the language and structure of which would not match what I had told her. She would understand within however long it took to read the first page of results that I had not told her the truth. And once she understood that, she would know that I was doing something, she would not know what. but she would know. I waited until I heard the sound of the television in the back room pause and restart, which told me Richard was still occupied and Vanessa had not gone to him. Then I took my phone from my pocket and called Thomas. It was just past 9 in the evening. He answered on the third ring. I told him what had happened in as few words as it required. I told him she had found the letter and asked his name, and that she would search it, and that when she did, my story would not hold. I told him we had days, not weeks, and possibly less than that. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man rapidly reordering a sequence of planned steps. He told me to come in first thing in the morning. I said I would be there when the door opened. I put the phone down and stood in the dark hallway and understood that the careful, measured timeline I had been working within had just been taken from me, and that what came next would happen on a different schedule than the one I had intended. Thomas was already at his desk when his assistant let me in at 8:15 the following morning, which told me he had come in early and that he had spent some portion of the night thinking about what I had told him. There was a second mug on the low table beside the usual one, and a legal pad with handwriting on it that he turned face down when I sat. Not from concealment, but from the habit of a man who processes information in his own sequence and presents it when he is ready rather than before. I sat down and wrapped my hands around the mug and waited. He began by walking me through what the discovery of that letter meant in practical terms. The letter itself was not incriminating. It referenced a consultation and some general language about asset filings, the kind of language that existed in correspondence from dozens of different legal contexts and could plausibly support the explanation I had given Vanessa. The problem was not the letter. The problem was the name, Thomas Whitaker, searched by someone who already had a reason to look carefully, would return results that pointed clearly to a practice built around estate protection and asset documentation. That specific combination, the letter's language and Thomas's specialty, would be enough to tell a careful observer that something more targeted than a routine will update had been underway. Vanessa was a careful observer. I did not need Thomas to explain to me what she would do once she had that information. I already knew. Thomas had spent the evening preparing an accelerated version of what we had been building toward. The protective filing on the deed could be completed that morning. The formal documentation separating my inherited assets from any marital financial record was already drafted and needed only my signature and notarization. He had also prepared as a precaution a preliminary cease and desist letter addressed to the matrimonial law office in the neighboring county, to be held and sent only if we received any indication that a legal claim was being formally initiated. He set each document in front of me in order explained what it did and what it would establish, and waited while I read each one before asking me to sign. I was midway through reading the third document when my phone rang. I did not recognize the number. Under ordinary circumstances, I would have let it go to voicemail and dealt with it later, but something made me look at Thomas and ask him if he minded. He gestured for me to take it. I answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's professional, measured the particular tone of someone accustomed to delivering information that requires a careful delivery. She identified herself as calling from a law office and asked whether she was speaking with Evelyn Carter. I said she was. She said her office represented Richard Carter in a matter concerning the potential initiation of a legal separation agreement and the equitable distribution of marital assets, and that they were reaching out to begin the process of scheduling a preliminary discussion. She said they had spoken with Mr. Carter earlier in the week and wished to proceed at his earliest convenience. I told her I would need to call her back. I ended the call. Thomas was watching me. I set the phone on the table between us and told him what the woman had said in the same level voice I would have used to read him a weather report. He did not react visibly. He asked me when Richard had spoken with their office. I told him the woman had said earlier in the week, which meant the contact had been made 3 days ago while I had been at Margaret's on a Tuesday afternoon. 3 days ago. While I had been sitting in my sister's living room drinking tea and talking about her garden, my husband had been on the phone with a matrimonial attorney. I called Richard. He answered quickly, which told me he had been expecting the call or something like it. I asked him about the attorney. There was a pause, not long, but long enough to carry everything that needed to be understood about the nature of his involvement. He said that Vanessa had suggested it. He said she had told him it was simply a matter of understanding their options, that it was exploratory, that it was not a big deal. He said it in the tone of a man repeating back the language he had been given, rather than speaking from his own understanding of what he had done. He had not read what he had signed up for. He He had walked into a lawyer's office and given his name and his relation to me and his willingness to be represented in a proceeding that was designed to dismantle everything my father had spent a lifetime protecting, and he had done it because someone had handed him the words for it, and he had not thought to look beyond them. I said very little in return. I told him I had heard him. I ended the call. I sat for a moment in the chair across from Thomas in that quiet office above the creaking staircase, and I thought about what it meant that Vanessa had moved to this step now this week with this urgency. She had searched Thomas's name. She had understood what it meant. And within days she had made her countermove, not carefully, not with the patience she had shown for years, but quickly, because she believed she was running out of time and needed to secure her position before I secured mine. She had been right that time was running out. She had been wrong about who it was running out for. I turned back to Thomas. I told him to do everything. I told him to do it now. Thomas moved quickly once I gave him the word, and watching him do so was its own particular education. I had always known him as a measured man, someone whose professional manner tended toward the deliberate and unhurried, and what I understood that morning was that his slowness in ordinary circumstances was a choice rather than a limitation. When speed was required, he was entirely capable of it, and what he produced under pressure had the same precision as what he produced with unlimited time, only compressed. Within the hour, he had contacted his office, redirected 2 colleagues to support the filings, and laid out for me a clear sequence of what would happen and in what order and approximately when each step would take effect. I listened to all of it, and then I asked him what I needed to do on my end, and he told me and I left. The first thing I did was go to the bank. I had banked at the same branch for 22 years, which meant the branch manager knew my face, if not always my name. And the woman at the counter who handled my request that morning was someone I had spoken with perhaps a dozen times over the years about nothing more consequential than replacing a lost card or updating a mailing address. I sat across from her at the small desk near the window, and I presented my identification and the documentation Thomas had sent to my phone that morning, and I told her clearly and without drama what I needed done. I needed Daniel and Vanessa's authorized access to the household account removed. I needed the contact information on the account updated to my personal information alone. I needed a record of every transaction made against the account in the past 18 months printed and held for me to collect. She looked at the documentation. She looked at my identification. She asked me a small number of procedural questions, the kind that exist to confirm that the person making the request is who they say they are and understands what they are asking for. I answered each one directly. The entire process took 43 minutes. When I walked out of the branch and into the gray December morning, the account was mine in every practical sense, not just legally, which it had always been, but operationally in the way that matters when someone reaches for access that is no longer there. Thomas, working in parallel from his office, filed the formal response to the matrimonial attorney's communication. It was a comprehensive document, I read it that evening, that set out in precise and well-documented terms the legal standing of my inherited assets, the clear titling history, the absence of any commingling that could support a reclassification claim, and the procedural irregularities involved in a third party arranging legal representation for a spouse in a marital matter without the other spouse's knowledge. The document did not accuse anyone of anything specific. It did not need to. It established in the dry and unambiguous language of legal correspondence that the legal separation argument had no foundation and that any attempt to pursue it would be met with a fully prepared and thoroughly documented response. The matrimonial office, Thomas told me later, acknowledged receipt within the afternoon. There was no further contact from them. The notice to vacate was hand-delivered to Daniel and Vanessa by a process server at 4:17 in the afternoon. I know the time because Thomas sent me a confirmation message at 4:22. The notice was formal and complete, citing their occupancy of my property without a lease rental agreement or any documented legal tenancy, and providing the 30-day period required by state law for them to arrange alternative accommodation. It was not a hostile document. It was a factual one. It described a situation accurately and specified what was required in response. I was home by 5 o'clock. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the printed transaction records from the bank and went through them page by page. This was not something Thomas had asked me to do. It was something I needed to do for myself, to see clearly and in full the actual record of what had been drawn from that account over 18 months, to understand the complete shape of what I had been financing without examination. I read every line. I set the pages in order when I finished and put them in the portfolio alongside my father's documents because they belonged there now, in the record of what was mine and what had been done with it. Vanessa's attempt came at 6:43 in the evening. I know because Daniel called me at 6:48, 5 minutes after she had tried and failed to access the account from her phone. I let his call go to voicemail. He called again at 6:51. I let that one go as well. At 7:04, he sent a text message, 3 sentences, the last of which said, "Please pick up." I set the phone face down on the table. Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point during this and looked at me for a moment and then looked at the phone and then back at me. He seemed to be waiting for me to explain something to him. I poured a second cup of tea and did not explain anything. He stood there for perhaps 20 seconds and then went back down the hall. And I listened to the familiar sounds of the house around me and thought about how many years I had provided explanations that were never asked for and answers to questions that were never fully heard. That night the house was very quiet. I sat at the kitchen table until quite late in the room that was mine, in the house that was mine, and for the first time in longer than I could accurately account for the quiet, felt like something that belonged to me as well. They came the following evening. I had expected they would come sooner. Vanessa was not a person who absorbed a reversal passively, and I had understood from the years of watching her that her response to losing ground was to move toward the thing that had taken it from her, rather than away from it. What had delayed her, I think, was the need to understand fully what she was walking into before she walked in. She would have spent the intervening hours establishing exactly what had been filed, what had been changed, what the legal landscape looked like from where she now stood. She would have wanted to know the dimensions of the room before she entered it. I had spent the day preparing in my own way, which did not involve attorneys or documentation beyond what was already in order. Thomas had offered to be present. I had thanked him and declined. I had understood from the beginning of all this that whatever conversation was coming needed to happen between the people it actually involved, and that the presence of a legal representative, however useful in other contexts, would have changed the nature of what I needed to say in a way that would have made it less rather than more honest. I was in the kitchen when I heard Daniel's car in the drive. I put the kettle on not because I intended to make tea for anyone, but because having something to do with my hands in the first seconds of a thing is a habit I have never seen a reason to break. I heard the front door. They still had a key, which I had decided not to change before this conversation, because I wanted them to be able to come in as they always had and find something different waiting for them, and then their footsteps in the hall. I came out of the kitchen and into the sitting room and told them to come in and sit down. The folder was on the coffee table. I had placed it there that morning and left it there all day, a plain manila folder with no label thick enough to be visible without being theatrical. I did not open it immediately. I sat in the chair across from them and I looked at them both for a moment the way I had looked at documents that required careful reading before I began. I told them I wanted to talk about the house. I said it calmly and without preface. I told them that a listing inquiry had been made in my name to a real estate firm regarding this property, and that I had received a communication from a matrimonial attorney's office regarding a separation proceeding initiated without my knowledge or consent. I said these things in the same tone I would have used to describe items on an agenda because that was in fact what they were. And then I opened the folder and placed the relevant documents on the table between us. I walked through each one, the deed with my name on it, as it had been for 31 years. The investment accounts titled to me as separate property documented from their origin and clearly maintained as such. The Connecticut property, the formal response Thomas had filed closing the matrimonial inquiry, the protective filings on the deed now recorded and in effect. I spoke slowly and without pausing for response, because I had decided before they arrived that I would complete what I needed to say before anyone else said anything, and I had enough experience managing difficult conversations to know how to hold that space without force. Vanessa began to say something partway through. I raised one hand briefly, and she stopped. When I finished, the room was quiet. Daniel was looking at the documents on the table with the expression of a man reading something in a language he understands, only partially assembling meaning from the pieces he can identify. Vanessa was looking at me. Her face was composed in the way it was always composed, but something behind the composure was working, recalculating. And for the first time in the years I had known her, I could see the calculation itself rather than only its results. Then Richard came in from the hallway. I had known he was in the house. His car had been in the drive when Daniel and Vanessa arrived, and I had heard no sound of him leaving. He came into the room slowly and stood near the doorway and looked at no one in particular for a moment, in the way of a man who has been listening from another room for long enough to know he has forfeited the right to a clean entrance. Daniel looked at his father and asked the question directly, whether he had known. Richard looked at the floor, and then at me, and then at some point between the two, and he said it clearly enough that there was no room for interpretation. He said he had known. He said he had known for a long time. He said he should have said something. 6 words at the end that cost more than the ones before them, because they acknowledged not just the knowing but the choice, the long, sustained choice to do nothing with what he knew. Vanessa turned to me then. Her voice had lost its careful evenness, and what was underneath it was not the anger I might have expected, but something more brittle, the particular tone of someone who has built an entire structure on an assumption they are only now discovering was wrong from the beginning. She said I could not simply do this. She did not complete the sentence. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about the box of dish gloves, the kitchen rearranged without asking the evening. She described my house to her friends as a property with unrealized potential. I thought about the fence my father built and painted white every 3 years for the rest of his life. And then I said what I had decided I would say plainly and without elaboration, because it was the truth, and the truth did not require decoration. I told her that she had not lost anything that day. I told her that what had happened was simply that she had found out she had never had it. She did not respond. There was nothing in the room that functioned as a response to that. I closed the folder and set it on the arm of my chair, and the 4 of us remained in the sitting room of my house for another moment, in a silence that had the specific quality of something that has been said and cannot be unsaid. And then I stood up and told them they knew where Thomas's office was if they had questions about the documents. The days immediately following the confrontation had a texture I had not anticipated. I had expected noise, phone calls, arguments, the particular sustained pressure that Vanessa applied when she wanted an outcome and had not yet obtained it. What I got instead was a specific and deliberate silence, the kind that is louder in its way than any argument, because it tells you that the person producing it has gone somewhere private to regroup rather than gone away. I knew the difference between someone who had stopped and someone who was recalculating, and I had known from the moment she walked out of my house that Vanessa was doing the latter. Thomas confirmed what she was doing approximately 10 days later. She had consulted a second attorney, not the matrimonial firm which had withdrawn cleanly after his response, but a different office, one that handled civil disputes and property litigation. She had brought the documentation she had gathered and laid out her argument and asked whether there was a path. Thomas had a professional network that told him these things with a discretion that I did not inquire into too carefully. What he told me was that the attorney had reviewed everything she presented, had reviewed the counter-documentation as well, and had told her plainly that the position she was challenging was airtight. The titling was clear. The separation of assets was properly established. The legal separation argument had already been formally closed. There was no viable case. What Thomas also told me in the same measured tone he used for all information regardless of its weight was that the cease and desist letter he had filed, the one addressing the arrangement of legal representation for Richard without my knowledge, had created a formal record in the court system. Nothing had been charged, nothing had been prosecuted, but the record existed. It documented the conduct, the date, the nature of what had been attempted, and the parties involved. It was a file that would remain accessible to any future attorney, any future proceeding, any future context in which someone wanted to know whether Vanessa had done this kind of thing before. She knew the file existed. Thomas had made certain of that. I did not feel triumphant when he told me these things. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something closer to the quiet that comes at the end of a long physical task, not joy but completion, the specific relief of a thing having been seen through to its conclusion. Daniel called me on a Thursday evening 11 days after the confrontation. He called from his own phone, not through Vanessa, and he called at a time when I suspected she was not nearby. I answered. He did not ask me to reconsider anything. He did not lead with an argument or a grievance or a request. He was quiet in the way he used to be quiet as a boy when he had done something he could not undo and had finally stopped pretending he hadn't. He asked me one question. He asked whether I had always known that everything was mine. I told him yes. There was a silence on the line. Not the silence of a person preparing a response, but the silence of a person absorbing something they have been refusing to absorb for a long time. Then he asked me why I had never said so. I thought about the question for a moment before I answered it. Not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to give him the honest one rather than the easy one. I told him I had never said so because no one had ever asked. I told him that was not a minor distinction. He did not say anything after that, and after a while we ended the call, and I sat with the particular heaviness of a conversation that has said exactly what it needed to say, and still left everything unresolved. Richard came to me 4 days later. He came in the early morning before the house had warmed up for the day, and he sat at the kitchen table in a way that told me he had been preparing for this conversation and was not entirely prepared. He said he was sorry. He said it several times and in several formulations, the way people do when they are not sure which version of the apology will reach the person they are apologizing to. He told me he had known about the assets for years. He had known that Vanessa was asking questions, had seen the shape of what she was building, and had said nothing because he had not wanted to make things worse. He believed, he said, that staying quiet was a form of staying neutral. He said it with a kind of bleak sincerity that told me he had only recently understood how wrong that belief had been. I listened to everything he said. I let him say all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, I sat for a moment, and then I told him clearly and without anger that I was not asking him to choose between me and Daniel. I told him that was not what was being asked. What I was asking, I told him, was one thing and one thing only: whether he could tell me the truth from this point forward. Not eventually. Not when it was comfortable. Every time, beginning now. He looked at me across the kitchen table, and in his face I saw the thing I had been afraid I would see. Not refusal, not dishonesty, but hesitation. A half-second of internal calculation, visible and unmistakable, in which the question he was being asked competed with something else he valued more. He wanted to say yes. I could see that he wanted to say yes, but wanting to say a thing and being able to mean it are separated by exactly the distance that hesitation covers. I had my answer before he spoke a word. He said yes. I want to be precise about that because it matters to the full account of what came next. He said yes, he could do that, he would do that, and he said it with a conviction that I think he genuinely felt in the moment he said it. That is the thing about Richard that I have spent the most time trying to understand, that he was not in the ordinary sense a dishonest man. He did not lie to me in the calculated, deliberate way that Vanessa had operated. What he did was something more complicated and in some ways more difficult to address because it had no clear villain at its center. He believed what he said when he said it. The problem was that his beliefs had a short half-life when they came into contact with his habits, and his deepest habit, refined over 38 years, was the avoidance of situations that required him to hold an uncomfortable position against the wishes of someone he loved. He said yes, and I thanked him, and he left the kitchen, and I sat for a while with my tea and thought about what yes meant, coming from a man whose hesitation had already shown me everything I needed to know. The days that followed were quiet in the way that precedes rather than follows. I went about the ordinary business of the apartment. I had been staying in my sister Margaret's spare room since the night after the confrontation, a temporary arrangement we had not yet discussed making permanent, and I worked through my days with the focused attention of someone who is watching a situation and waiting for it to finish showing itself. I was not waiting for Vanessa. Her next move had been closed off, and she knew it. I was waiting for Richard because the hesitation I had seen in his face had told me something was coming, and I preferred to see it clearly when it arrived rather than find it after the fact in a form I had not prepared for. Laura called on a Thursday evening just after 7. She called from her car, which told me she had waited until she was away from her own house to make the call, which told me before she said a word that what she was about to tell me was something she had been holding since earlier in the day and had needed time and distance to approach. She told me without a long approach. She said that a friend of hers who lived 2 streets from Daniel and Vanessa's new rental had seen Richard's car parked outside their building the previous afternoon. The friend had mentioned it to Laura because she knew the situation and thought Laura should know. Laura had called Richard that evening before she called me. She had asked him directly whether he had been to see Daniel and Vanessa. He had paused, and then he had told her the truth, or the version of the truth that he was capable of telling, which was the truth, stripped of its full implications. He said he had gone to see Daniel. He said he had brought a check from his personal savings account. He said Daniel was struggling and he could not simply watch that happen. He said he had not told me because he knew how I would receive it. I sat in Margaret's spare room and held the phone and listened to Laura tell me all of this, and I felt something settle in me that had been slightly unsettled since the morning Richard had sat at the kitchen table and said yes. Not devastation, not even surprise, not really. It was the specific feeling of a thing you have been quietly bracing for finally arriving, and the strange lightness that comes when the bracing is no longer needed. The money itself was not the injury. I want to be honest about that too. His savings account was his, and what he did with it was legally his to decide. And I did not begrudge Daniel whatever his father had given him from what was his own to give. The injury was the shape of the act. He had sat across from me and said yes, he could tell the truth beginning now, and within days he had done the precise thing he had known I would not receive well and had not told me. Not because he was cruel, because he was exactly who I had seen in that half second of hesitation, a man who loved his son more than he was capable of changing, and who would go on making that choice quietly and indefinitely, and who would always have a reasonable explanation for why this particular instance was different. I thanked Laura. I told her she had done the right thing by calling me. After we said goodbye, I sat for a little while in the chair by the window and looked at the street below, the ordinary Thursday evening traffic of a residential neighborhood, people coming home from things and going toward other things, the specific, unremarkable continuity of other people's lives. Moving past. Then I called Thomas. He answered on the second ring. I told him what had happened briefly and in plain terms. I told him I would like to begin formal legal separation proceedings, my own proceedings on my own behalf. He said he understood, and he said he would have the preliminary paperwork ready by Monday morning, and he said it in the same level, careful tone he used for everything, which was the tone of a person who respects you enough not to add commentary to your decisions. I thanked him and ended the call, and then I called Margaret. She asked me how I was. I told her I was all right, and it was true. She asked if I wanted her to come over. I told her not tonight. I told her I had just needed to hear a voice I trusted. She said she understood. We stayed on the phone a while longer without talking about anything in particular, which was its own kind of answer to a question neither of us had asked aloud. The formal separation paperwork took 3 weeks to prepare properly, which gave me time to make a decision I had been approaching from a distance for longer than I had admitted to myself. The decision was not about the house. I want to be clear about that because I think it would be easy to read what I did next as a retreat, as a woman driven from her own property by the weight of what had happened inside it, and that reading would be wrong in a way that matters to me. The house was mine. It remained mine throughout the proceedings, and would remain mine after them. I could have stayed in it. I chose not to. And the difference between those two things is the whole point. What I understood in the 3 weeks of quiet that followed my conversation with Thomas was that the house had accumulated too much of a particular kind of history to be for the moment a place where I could begin something genuinely new. Every room in it was organized around the life I had been living rather than the one I intended to live. The kitchen where I had cooked 30 years of meals for other people's schedules. The study where I had found my father's documents in the dark. The sitting room where I had watched Vanessa describe her plans for a future that had not in the end materialized. A house holds what happens in it for a long time, and I had decided I needed, at least for now, walls that held nothing yet. I found a small apartment on the other side of town on the 3rd floor of a building with good light, and a landlord who communicated by email and asked no questions beyond the practical ones. Margaret helped me identify it. Laura helped me move into it on a Saturday in early February, the kind of day that could not decide between winter and something more tentative, the sky shifting between gray and a pale, uncertain blue. We carried boxes up the 3 flights in the particular companionable silence of people doing physical work together who do not need to fill the space between them with conversation. Laura was efficient and careful with everything she handled. She did not offer opinions about the apartment or my choices or what any of it meant. She simply helped me move, which was what I had needed and what she knew I had needed without being told. We had lunch afterward at a small place near the building, a diner with laminate tables and good coffee and the specific warmth of a room that has been feeding people through cold weather for a long time. Laura ordered soup. I ordered eggs. We sat across from each other and talked about ordinary things, her work, a book. She was reading something funny that had happened at Margaret's the previous week, and the normalcy of it was its own kind of gift, the confirmation that the ground beneath us was still solid and that what had shifted was not the fundamental thing. Daniel came to the apartment 4 days after I moved in. I had not told him the address, but Laura had, which I had expected and had decided I was glad of. He came on a Wednesday evening and stood in the doorway of the 3rd floor landing in a coat that was slightly too light for the weather, and he looked like a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and was now finding the rehearsal inadequate. I let him in and offered him coffee, and he accepted it and wrapped both hands around the mug the way people do when they are cold and also when they do not quite know what to do with their hands. He said he wanted to know what he could do. He said it simply and without the architecture of justification that had surrounded most of his previous attempts to reach me. Just the question, plain and direct, which was the first time in recent memory that he had asked me something without Vanessa's framing around it. I sat across from him at the small kitchen table, and I looked at my son, this 35-year-old man who had my father's eyes and his father's habit of looking slightly to the left of a thing when it was too direct to look at straight, and I told him the truth in the clearest terms I had. I told him I loved him. I said it first because it was true and because I needed him to know that nothing that came after it canceled it out. Then I told him that I was not waiting for anyone anymore. I told him that I was not standing at any door and that I was not measuring time by when he would be ready to have the conversation that needed to happen between us. I told him that the door was not closed, but that I had stopped standing at it, and that if he wanted a relationship with me built on something real, he knew what it required. He would need to be honest about what he had known and when he had known it and why he had made the choices he made, not for my satisfaction, for his own. Because a person cannot build something new on a foundation they have not been willing to examine. He nodded. He did not argue, and he did not defend, and he did not explain, which was itself a kind of answer, and a better one than I had expected. He finished his coffee. He thanked me for letting him come up. He said he would be in touch. At the door he paused for a moment with his hand on the frame and looked back at me with an expression I recognized from when he was very young, before he learned to cover what he felt with the composure that had always been more Vanessa's style than his. He looked for just that moment, like someone finding his way back to something he had misplaced a long time ago. I closed the door and stood in my own hallway in my own apartment and listened to his footsteps go down the 3 flights and the door at the bottom open and close, and then I stood in the quiet for a moment longer because the quiet was mine and I had learned finally not to fill it before I was ready. The apartment had been mine for 6 weeks by the time the particular Tuesday morning arrived that I want to tell you about. 6 weeks is not a long time in the ordinary accounting of a life, but it had been long enough for certain things to become familiar in a way that surprised me with how quickly they settled the specific quality of light through the east-facing window in the early hour, the sound, the radiator, made as the building warmed up, the fact that the coffee was always exactly as strong as I made it because I was the only person who made it. These were small things. I had not expected small things to carry so much weight. I had furnished the apartment simply taking from the house only what was mine in the personal rather than the legal sense: my father's reading chair, the lamp from the study, a set of dishes I had bought myself years ago and always liked. The leather portfolio sat on the desk in what I used as a second room, and beside it on the windowsill was a photograph in a plain frame, my parents at the shore sometime in the early 1960s, my father squinting into the sun with the particular expression he wore when he was happy and slightly embarrassed by it. I had kept that photograph on a shelf in 3 different houses. It looked right here. It looked, in fact, more right here than it had anywhere. On that Tuesday morning I woke at my usual hour, made coffee, and sat at the small kitchen table with no particular plan for what came next. I had a call with a former colleague in the afternoon, and Margaret was coming by later, and there was nothing between breakfast and those 2 events that required me to be anywhere or do anything for anyone. I sat with that open space for a moment, the way you sit with something unfamiliar that has turned out not to be threatening. And then I opened my laptop. I had told myself I was going to look at a recipe. I found myself on an airline website instead. There is a photograph that I have moved from house to house since 1987. I cut it from a travel magazine when I was 30 years old and newly married, and full of the particular confidence that the future holds everything you have not yet gotten to. It is a photograph of the Ponte Vecchio in Florence, the old bridge over the Arno, with the buildings stacked along its edges and the light hitting the water at the angle that makes the whole thing look like something a person might have invented rather than found. I had put that photograph in a drawer when other things took precedence, which was almost immediately, and then moved it to a new drawer and then to a new house, and eventually to the apartment where it was tucked between two books on the shelf beside my father's chair. I had never gone to the place it showed. There had always been something else. I looked at flights for a long time. I looked at hotels and neighborhoods and walking distances, and what the weather was like in different seasons, and whether it was better to arrive in the morning or the evening. I did this with the focused attention of a person doing something real, rather than something they are merely entertaining. At 11:47 on a Tuesday morning in January, I booked a 2-week trip to Florence, departing in 6 weeks, returning on a schedule I had set to accommodate no one's preferences but my own. A room in a small hotel near the Oltrarno neighborhood, which several things I had read described as quieter than the center and belonging more genuinely to the people who actually lived there. The total cost appeared on the screen and I looked at it for a moment. The moment passed. I entered my card number and confirmed the booking, and then I sat back in my chair and looked at the confirmation number on the screen and thought about a 30-year-old woman cutting a photograph from a magazine with a pair of kitchen scissors and the absolute certainty that she would get there eventually. Margaret came at 3 o'clock as she had said she would, and I made fresh coffee and set out the things she liked, and we sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon light that came through the east window at that hour in a long, pale stripe across the floor. I told her about Florence before she had taken off her coat. I showed her the confirmation on my phone. She looked at it and then she looked at me, with the specific attention of a person examining something they have been waiting a long time to see. She said she had not seen me look like that since we were in our 30s. She said it quietly and without elaboration, the way she said the things she meant most, and I did not try to respond to it because there was nothing to add. After she left, I walked to the small grocery 3 blocks from the apartment to pick up a few things for dinner. Near the entrance, there was a bucket of cut flowers, the kind of simple arrangement that grocery stores keep near the door, nothing elaborate, just color and stem. There was a bunch of yellow ones, bright and slightly overblown the way flowers get when they have been in the bucket a day too long and are making a last effort. I put them in my basket without deliberating over it. I brought them home and put them in a glass on the kitchen table and sat down across from them and ate my dinner. No occasion, no one to notice them. Just a woman who had finally stopped waiting for a reason and decided that being alive on a Tuesday was reason enough. Florence in February is not the Florence of travel photographs. The light is thinner, the tourists fewer, and the city goes about its actual business with an indifference to being observed that I found from the first morning deeply restoring. My hotel was a narrow building on a side street in the Oltrarno, with a proprietress who spoke limited English and communicated primarily through a system of gestures and expressions that proved entirely adequate for every practical purpose. My room had a window that looked onto a courtyard where a man brought his bicycle every morning and wheeled it back in every evening, and I watched this small ritual with the pleasure of someone who has been given unexpectedly access to the ordinary life of a place they had only previously imagined. I want to tell you about the bridge, but before I do, there are things that happened in the weeks before I left that belong in the full account, and I will give them their proper place. Vanessa's departure from Daniel's life happened without drama, which I think surprised people who had been expecting a final scene. She left for her family's city in the first week of January. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no conversation that anyone reported to me. She had assessed the situation and found it no longer workable, which was, when I thought about it, entirely consistent with everything I knew about how she operated. The arrangement she had engineered required a specific set of conditions to function, and those conditions were gone. She closed what could not be made to work and moved on. I did not feel anything in particular when Margaret told me. There was nothing left to feel about Vanessa that I had not already finished feeling. Richard's letter arrived on a Wednesday in mid-January, forwarded to the apartment through Thomas's office, which was how we had arranged all formal correspondence during the separation proceedings. It was a single-page handwritten, which surprised me because Richard had always preferred the distance of the typed and the printed. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for anything. He said he knew he had let me down, and that he had spent a long time telling himself he had not known how to be braver, and that he had recently understood the distinction between not knowing and not trying hard enough to learn. He said he hoped I would be well. He said the house had always been more mine than he had acknowledged, and that he was sorry it had taken circumstances like these to make him say it. I read the letter twice and then placed it in the drawer beside my father's portfolio, which was where I kept the things I had not yet decided about. It stayed there when I left for Florence. Some things are not ready to be resolved, and do not need to be forced into resolution before their time. Daniel's letter came 4 days before my flight. 3 pages handwritten on the kind of lined paper people use when they are writing something they cannot type, because typing would make it too easy to delete. His handwriting had the particular quality of someone writing carefully, working to be legible, which told me something about his state of mind before I read a word. He wrote about his childhood briefly, and about the things he had taken for granted in a way he was only recently capable of naming clearly. He wrote about Vanessa and about his own choices, and in the second page he said the thing I had not expected. He said he had known more than he had admitted, not all of it, not the full extent of what she had been building, but enough. He had seen certain things and chosen not to look at them directly, had told himself it was not his place to interfere, had found the comfort of the person who does not want to know more than they already know, because knowing more would require them to act. He said he had been lying to himself. He said it had taken losing his mother's daily presence to understand what it had cost, and that he was sorry, and that he was not asking her to accept the apology immediately or on any schedule but his own. He was simply asking her to know that it had been said and that it had been meant. I read the letter at the kitchen table with the yellow flowers, which by then had passed their best days and were leaning slightly to one side in the glass. I sat with it for a while. Then I put it in the drawer, not because I intended to leave it unanswered, but because the right answer was not one I could write yet, and Daniel's letter of everything that had arrived that month deserved the truest response I could give it. I would write to him when I came home. I knew I would. On the 4th morning in Florence, I walked to the Ponte Vecchio before the city had fully woken. It was just past 7. The light on the Arno was the color of old honey, and the bridge with its stacked buildings rose from the water exactly as it had in the photograph I had carried for 30 years. I had the photograph in my jacket pocket. I did not take it out to compare. I simply stood on the bridge in the thin February light, watching the river move beneath me. And I thought about nothing in particular for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure. A woman beside me said something to her companion in Italian that I could not translate. They moved on. The light shifted. I stayed. For 58 years I had been defined by what I gave. My time, my house, my silence, my name on every document that kept them safe while no one thought to ask whose name it was. I do not regret any of it, but I am no longer available to be taken for granted. My name is Evelyn Carter. I own everything they thought was theirs. And standing on that bridge in the early morning light of a city I had waited 30 years to reach, I understood something my father had known when he put my name on every document, with such care that belonging to yourself is not a thing anyone can give you. It is only ever a thing you decide. If you have stayed with this story until now, then I think you already know why it stayed with me too. Evelyn never raised her voice. She never made a scene. She did not chase anyone down or demand to be seen. She simply stopped pretending that she was less than she was, and that decision made quietly in the middle of the night in her father's study changed everything. What strikes me most about her story is not the reversal, though the reversal is extraordinary. What strikes me is how long she waited and how many women I think would recognize that waiting. The habit of making yourself smaller so that the people around you can feel larger is one of the most common and least examined things that happens inside families, and it does not announce itself as a sacrifice. It announces itself as keeping the peace. It announces itself as not making things difficult. And by the time you notice what it has cost you, it has been costing you for years. So here is what I would say simply and directly: do not wait for someone to hand you permission to know your own worth. Do not assume that because you have been quiet, the people around you have been unaware. And do not confuse loyalty with erasure. You can love your family and still protect yourself. You can be generous and still hold your name on every document that matters. Evelyn did not win because she was ruthless. She won because she finally decided that the truth about her own life was worth defending. That is not revenge. That is self-respect. And it is never too late to choose it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.